Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, last week, Khazanah Research Institute issued the Welfare in Malaysia Across 3 Decades report. Now, it's the first of its 3-part annual The State of Households report. And joining us on the show tonight is one of the authors, Christopher Choong. He's the Deputy Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute. Good evening, Chris. Now, that report that just came out, it notes that there had been improvement in terms of the welfare of Malaysian households on the whole over the last 3 decades from 1990. Now, progress has come in the form of increases in average household income and consumption spending, as well as we've seen declines in absolute poverty rates, as well as income inequality. Christopher, can you help us understand the basis of that progress?
Yeah, first of all, hi Melisa and hi Sharaad. Thank you so much for giving airtime to KRI's report again. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to be able to share our findings and analysis with the public, I think through Astro AWANI.
Most welcome.
Yeah, sorry, I'm hearing some feedback as I speak, so it's a little bit disruptive, sorry.
All right, we'll try and fix that while you're speaking. But go ahead, Chris, and tell us what's behind this progress that we've seen in terms of household income, consumption, and savings and debt.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do, one of the sort of key theses in our report is basically to say that the way we assess households' welfare, and here we are defining welfare in terms of income and expenditure, is that it cannot be disembedded with how we understand the economy. Or you can think about it conversely, in the sense that the way we assess the state of our economy also has to be rooted in how households or individuals are doing in terms of the realities that they face in terms of income inequality or in terms of poverty. So I think the kind of progress that you see in terms of the rise in mean and median income, I think over 3 decades. So what we wanted to basically do is to look at Vision 2020 in this kind of 3 periods, because we felt that it could be actually more meaningful to look at it in terms of long-term trends as opposed to just taking a snapshot in time. And so you do see the kind of rapid increase in mean and median income across the 3 decades, which to us is of course a proxy to welfare improvement. And then, of course, we know that the country has actually industrialized quite a bit over the 3 decades. But what we really wanted to do is actually to inject some nuances and complexities to the debate, because the question that we are asking is whether the increase in income and expenditure itself is sufficient to explain progress in terms of welfare, and would that actually be a bit more limited in terms of capturing how people are actually feeling on the ground.
Right, Chris, is there a reason why you take 3 decades? As I understand it, kind of roughly it coincides with the end of the NEP, and then it has the successor policy, at least from the government perspective. But there are other factors that forced you to think about it in terms of these 3 decades?
Well, actually, I must say that the report itself follows what we call the Household Income and Expenditure Survey. So we basically do this flagship publication every time the Department of Statistics release the household surveys to the public. But when we were sort of conceptualizing this report back in 2019, and this is actually before the pandemic and all that, and looking sort of ahead to 2020, and we felt that, for many of us who sort of grew up with this idea of wawasan 2020 very much ingrained in the psyche of how we think and imagine the development of Malaysia. So we thought that it could be actually quite meaningful to take a longer term perspective and to actually assess the Vision 2020 period. And the reason why we sort of has demarcated this into 3 periods is because it's in a loose way follows the financial crisis. So it always starts at the end of a financial crisis, and then it sort of begins. It starts at the end of one financial crisis, and then it will sort of stop at the onset of another crisis. So, like the first period is from 1989 to I think 97. Then you have 99 to 2009, 2007, and then 2009 to 2019, which to us maybe like represent the kind of policy regimes of the 3 periods. And we wanted to compare how the 3 periods have actually done in terms of policies and also different administration at that time, I think.
Well, Chris, you mentioned a bit earlier that increases in household income and expenditure doesn't necessarily mean that doesn't necessarily translate into an interpretation that the welfare of households have improved. Can you talk us through a little bit of the nuances in how you're looking at that data?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have done is to look at the growth rates as opposed to just the absolute increase in the mean and median income. So the sort of one striking finding is that post-Asian financial crisis, we have actually seen household income has actually moderated post-Asian financial crisis and to substantially quite actually low levels. And although it has actually bounced back after the global financial crisis, but it has actually not reached the kind of levels that we have seen in the pre-Asian financial crisis. And of course, this is also a reflection of the kind of GDP numbers that we have seen, very rapid GDP growth in the first period, and then it moderates and it never kind of like bounced back to the pre-crisis levels. So, and when you sort of think about it in terms of more intuitive terms, when production activities have slowed, what could be then driving household income? And I think this is when we sort of dig deeper into the sources of household income. And sure enough, we found that what is driving household income is not actually paid employment income or wages, but it's actually driven by the other sources of income that are published by DOS. So things like transfers, self-employment income, and also property and investments income. So it's not really wages.
Christopher, explain what transfers mean. Very quickly.
Yeah, so transfers could be transfers from the state, the government to the households, and it can also be inter-household transfers. That means, let's say you get your child gives to the parents some allowance when you're working. So yeah, it can be households, it can be government.
Okay, so Christopher, there's the fact that you lay out, which is that there's been a tripling of income over this period. Now that sounds impressive in itself, but it's over a 3-decade period. How does the ordinary person understand this tripling in income? Do we need a comparative perspective? Do we have to look at other countries to see whether tripling is really significant or insignificant? How would you measure that?
Well, one way to look at this is to look at, say, total household income as a percentage of GDP. So I think if you look at that number, it does show that as a percentage of GDP, household income has been increasing over time. But I think for the more recent periods, like 2019 and all that has sort of like moderated and stabilized for the most recent years.
Okay. All right, Christopher, we're going to take a quick break, but we're going to have you stay on the line. And when we come back, we're going to discuss the challenges that remain, particularly in addressing poverty and inequality among households. So stay tuned to Consider This.
COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great.
Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan, and we're speaking tonight to Christopher Choong, Deputy Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute. We're discussing the recently released Welfare in Malaysia Across 3 Decades report. Christopher, if I may come to the issue of poverty and inequality, the report cites that fewer households are in absolute poverty, but relative poverty persists. So the number of those who are absolutely poor have declined, and yet many more, but yet we have still many more who are vulnerable. And I want to ask you about what this report has found within the 3 decades in terms of inequality in Malaysia.
Yeah, if you look at absolute poverty, you see the kind of very rapid reduction in absolute poverty rates. And even, I mean, the government has actually introduced a new poverty line back in, I think, July this year. And I would say that even if you apply the new method in terms of how you calculate poverty and you sort of run that back to several years, say all the way back to 1989, I think you will still see the kind of trend that will go downwards, which I think is a testimony that the country has actually been able to reduce absolute poverty. But that is based on the philosophy of, you know, meeting basic needs in terms of subsisting and so on. But when we look at another measure, which is called relative poverty, and you can think about this in terms of being benchmarked to the average living standards of society. And economists tend to use median income sort of as a benchmark. And you see that for that measure, the relative poverty over the 3 decades actually has not been declining as rapidly as absolute poverty. In fact, I think for the most recent year, for 2019, it is actually like there's an uptick in relative poverty. And so when we sort of put all these different measures of poverty together with, you know, some analysis of poverty gaps or poverty intensity, I think the narrative that we put together is the fact that we see a lot of the households are actually, they have been lifted from the very bottom of the income distribution. So if you think about it, if there's a floor, they've been lifted off the floor, but they're just slightly crossing the absolute poverty line, which has been set at a very low base to begin with. So they're all hovering like slightly above the line, but they're actually still quite far in terms of, you know, catching up to the average living standards. And I think that has a lot of...
Yeah, sorry, if I could just jump in there. When in practical terms, how does this affect, say, intergenerational mobility, which is often the sign of a successful society, right? Your parents are farmers, and then you become a doctor, for instance. Does relative poverty translate into a lack of opportunities for intergenerational advancement?
I would think that it applies more in terms of like how we think about vulnerability. I mean, intergenerational mobility is quite important as well. And I think that one you will need a sort of a separate way to approach the data and the question, because you need to look at the relationship between the parents and the child. But for this, I think what I think it should sort of shock us a little bit in terms of how we think about the large number of vulnerable households that we have. And the numbers that we have been showing is that because of the difference between relative poverty the relative poverty line and the absolute poverty line is about 700 ringgit. And so a shock of about 700 ringgit will sort of cost about 800 over 1,000 households to more than 1 million, depends on how you calculate relative poverty, to sort of fall back into absolute poverty. And we are talking about 2019 numbers here. So these are numbers before the pandemic and so on. So now I think we are right in the thick of COVID and the economic crisis. So I would suspect that a lot of them would have fallen through the cracks already.
And are these, was this shocking to you in terms of the data? When you looked at this data and saw the 700 ringgit difference, was that shocking to you? Or is this something that's already part of policymakers, that they are aware of this issue? Or is it a blind spot, Christopher?
Yeah, I would say that, maybe people feel it on the ground and all that, but I don't think in terms of seeing it in concrete numbers is something that we have done, simply because I think relative poverty is only for the first time published for 2019. So that's why we can do that kind of comparisons. And for me, I think personally, when I look at it, like before that, absolute poverty is about like 17,000 people. But the moment we factor in relative poverty, we're talking about 1 million households. So, to me, that number is huge.
Right. So, Christopher, it also brings us to the question of economic transformations, the kind of labor market structures, what jobs are available. What was happening over those 3 decades that have let so many Malaysians still remain vulnerable, as it were, to shocks, as you put it, external or domestic?
No, in fact, I mean, that's our argument on the inequality side, because we do see a reduction in the inequality. But the question we are asking is whether this reduction in inequality is because everyone is maybe equally as bad, as opposed to some kind of catching up that is happening, that is driven by the structural transformation in the economy. But what we see actually is a kind of broad convergence towards a lower economic growth path, and I think that, in a way, I would say, is driven by deindustrialization that we have seen, because it's post-Asian financial crisis when we start to see the kind of moderation in household income, when we know that China has kind of like entered the World Trade Organization in the year 2000, and our deindustrialization story sort of like began about the same time as well. So we have not been able to sort of upgrade our manufacturing base, at least not to the kind of skill pace that is needed to catch up with more advanced economies. So I want to do a plug for the second part of our report, which actually dives deeper into this question, where we are looking at work in an evolving Malaysia, where we look deeper into this whole question about deindustrialization and how that is actually affecting decent work in Malaysia. So look out for that one. It's going to come out next month.
Christopher, I do want to ask you, I mean, there has been for some time now the discussion about premature deindustrialization. Economists like Jomo Sundaram have mentioned this. The question is this something that governments can address, or is it simply the operations of the market, not just a domestic market, but the international division of labor? Is anybody in Malaysia empowered to kind of negotiate something like this?
That's a very tough question in a sense, because I think there is the whole domestic policy space that we need to navigate, but there's also the whole international dimension, because you're talking about foreign capital, the kind of conditions that we can impose on foreign investments, and to what extent we can ensure that there's proper transfer of technology, and given the fact that we are a trading nation, export oriented, we are a small economy, like we may not have the kind of bargaining power like China, which can do some of these things. So I would say it's a tough one, but we need to argue more for more industrial policy space for us to do so, and I think this is something that we need to leverage on the sort of global South context. And I think sort of in the early days of our independence, there was this kind of strong movements in the global South on non-aligned movements and all that. Basically, asking for more bargaining power, for developing countries like Malaysia.
Right.
I mean, those definitely has gone out of the scope of our report. But so this is my reflections
but definitely
on that
worth a wider conversation. But what we'll do is we'll come back after a quick break and discuss how we can look at our national social protection system, perhaps strengthening those social safety nets. We'll be back with more in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned to consider this.
Not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax.
Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan. We're speaking to Christopher Choong from Khazanah Research Institute about the welfare in Malaysia across 3 decades report. Christopher, if I'll come back to the issue of national social protection, the national social protection system. Now, in the report, you KRI argues that there needs to be an increase in the social assistance spending. In fact, it's been increased 5 times over the space of 30 years. Could you elaborate a little more? What exactly needs to be widened or broadened or increased?
Yeah, I think in terms of the social protection, the core, to deepen and broaden our social protection landscape, and we do have some specific recommendations in mind. And that, to some extent, it has become also a platitude. Like a lot of people are saying this sort of without going into the details of what this means. And I would say that one is really to think in terms of safeguarding the kind of social risks that different households or individuals face across the life course. And that requires a kind of shift away from the way we have been thinking about cash transfers, which is based on a kind of very crude household income like the B40 as a basis of how we do our targeting. And so to move towards some form of a family-based or some people call it life cycle approach, where you provide benefits to children, or to look at risks when you are in your working age, or for things like maternity leave or paternity leave, and then as you sort of retire, you think about things like social pension and all that. So I think on one hand, because of the large vulnerability that we have seen, there is definitely a case to sort of put in place something a bit more comprehensive like this, and then to complement this with some more sort of active labour market policies, which looks at things like training, unemployment insurance, which we already have. And I think through the COVID, we have also seen how this infrastructure has proven to be actually quite useful in terms of how we need to reach out to different individuals or households during an emergency like a pandemic. But I think there's still scope to...
Right, Christopher, your report seems to suggest that the progress that we've made is largely related to the growth story that we had, right? And so when we talk about increased social spending, we're looking at really the redistributive justice dimension of the story. But what about that growth story? If we have stagnating growth or low-level growth, how does that play out in terms of our ability to do the tax and transfer, to do the redistributive justice kind of work that you are mentioning now?
Yeah, I mean, people tend to think of this in a, like the kind of sequential way that we need to grow the economy before we need to invest in social protection. But I would argue that the causality can run the other way as well. In the sense that when you have a strong safety net and individuals or households feel that they have something to fall back to, maybe that is also a driver to the fact that they dare to take more risks in society and unleash that kind of dynamism or entrepreneurship into the economy. I mean, that's one way to think about it. But I would say that but beyond that, we also need to focus on structural transformation. In fact, I think that's the running theme of our report, that whatever that's happening with inequality, poverty, and income is related to deindustrialization and all that. So we definitely need to also push for a reindustrialization agenda, which in a way is also captured in the the SPV 2030. But I would say that the other fact that we want to highlight is actually when you do reindustrialization and to push for higher growth, there might be some trade-offs that we also might need to navigate, with whether when we push for higher growth, but we see also higher inequality that we have seen, for example, in the first period in the pre-Asian financial crisis. And in fact, our data is showing, for example, that a large number of our workers they are actually in high income industries or sectors, but those sectors are also generally more unequal, and there are not many workers in those kind of sectors. So if we move a large part of our workers from, say, the middle level kind of income to this kind of high income, high unequal sectors, you will generate the kind of inter and intra-sectoral dynamics that will contribute to higher inequality. So how do we think about this trade-off? And I would say that...
Sorry, Christopher, does that come hand in hand? You talk about the structural transformation. Does that have to come, would better social safety nets have to come hand in hand with structural transformation? Or is one more short-term versus the other?
No, in fact, I think they can come hand in hand, which is why I'm saying that if we were to focus, for example, on upgrading our manufacturing industries, which at the moment is slightly on the lower income type of, paying lower income type of jobs, and if we were to upgrade this, but at the same time deal with issues of distribution within the sector to focus on things like wage inequality or labor income distribution, and putting in place social safety nets, as I said, to ensure that people have something to fall back on if they take risks, in their life and in their business choices and all that. I don't see that it should be a trade-off, and I think there are ways we can achieve both growth and a reduction of inequality at the same time.
Christopher, correct me if I'm wrong, but I hear the spectre of universal basic income or something in the room that you seem to be suggesting, because precisely that is the argument. Get people out of precarious work and into something, or at least address the question of the precarity of work by providing them a stable income. Is that something, a conversation that you like to see happening in Malaysia, universal basic income?
Yeah, I think it's okay to have the conversation, but I don't think that's my position, I must say. But I'm calling for a comprehensive social safety net which looks at different types of social risks as opposed to something that you give. Universal basic income may have its merits, but I'm not sure whether we have the resources to do this for now. Like even I think like to do some costing on the proposals that we have, I think we're also looking at some rather high numbers. Yeah. So I think we can progress, I think one step at a time, I suppose.
Okay. And I think in the couple of minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you about this report. Now, the State of Households report that Khazanah Research Institute puts out almost every year for a few years now. I'm sure many others like myself follow that report, go through it every year and learn about the lived realities of Malaysian households. I'm wondering, Christopher, are we the only ones who do this? Are policymakers looking at this report? Are the findings of the State of Household reports put out by KRI used to inform decision-making and policy-making in Malaysia?
Yeah, I mean, we normally use the report to engage with the government, different parts of the government. So we do actually have, we share the findings and all that with different stakeholders. I think the team back in Malaysia, they are also planning to host certain roundtables and all that to communicate our findings and what are some of the bases in terms of our recommendations and all that. So I think the platform is there and we have been communicating, but whether at the end of the day the recommendations are adopted or not, of course, will be beyond the reach of the researcher, I suppose.
Christopher, last question, and it's probably a big one, which is we talk a lot about policy, we talk about the role of government, but is government really today in the 21st century what we should be relying on? Is it the markets and entrepreneurs and businesses and foreign capital that's actually driven the Malaysian success story rather than government?
Well, I think you would need both. Like in the first period, for example, it's very much driven by FDIs and all that. And I think the record of that is that it's quite mixed. The success, the impact of FDIs on our sort of local capabilities to upgrade our technological capabilities and all that, I think the results are quite mixed. And you sometimes do need the government to come in to direct and to facilitate some of this role. And like post-Asian financial crisis, we've seen a big drop in private investments in the country. And it was actually public investments that come in to sort of take up that slack. But whether you see that as crowding in or crowding out private investments, I think is something that we need to think about. But I think that there's potential for more catalytic combination in terms of how we go forward. Right. Yeah, so I wouldn't see it can't be just a total market-driven kind of development, especially if we want to focus on the welfare of households and what this means for poverty and inequality.
Right. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time, sharing the insights and the findings of this report. We look forward to part 2 of it. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.